Hello, America, and welcome back to one of my. I already figured that out. Hello, America, and everyone in the world interested in making electronics. Welcome back. I'm Paul. This is another one of my shoddy training videos for making electronics. Today we're going to go over soldering. First try?
Today's video is meant for beginners, but we're going to be going over how I believe you would be able to consistently make very high quality electronics when soldering. Laid out on this table are all of the parts that I normally use whenever I solder. I keep all of these parts in a single box, and I may not use all of these tools during any soldering session, but generally these tools are what I use over and over for most soldering jobs. Soldering specific hardware would be the iron heater, the iron and the iron stand, the brass sponge and the desoldering pump. The brass sponge is for cleaning off the soldering iron, and the desoldering pump is for removing solder in case you make any mistakes. Then there are the consumables. What I mean by consumables are any items that you use up over time. Sort of like you use up gasoline in your car. In soldering, you'll use up solder wick, solder, flux, rubber gloves, flux wash, and compressed air. The general tools that you'll need for soldering are the multimeter, the wire cutters and strippers, pliers, and a clamp. Of course, the last thing that you'll need while you're soldering are the actual parts that you're going to be soldering and whatever headers or wires that are going to be going onto this. Today we're going to be working on a SparkFun Logomatic. We're going to be adding headers to this, and then I also have a real-time clock here, focus, that I'm going to be removing female headers from it, and I'll be adding male headers to it. Good soldering comes from part OCD cleanliness, a hot and good quality iron, and a little black magic feeling of how the iron and solder react together. To make sure that you make a very good product, practice on a few throwaway solder joints before working on any actual product for every single soldering session, especially if you haven't soldered in a while. I'd recommend you keep doing this until you are an adequately experienced soldering person. So here's our general procedure. With a rubber glove on your hand holding the electronics, spray flux spray pretty liberally onto the device, and then shake it off. You can also use the canned air to spray away the flux wash. The flux wash is an alcohol-based solution. It's going to be removing any kinds of dust or small bits of debris that will be on the electronic. You'll want to do this to pretty much all of the devices that you're going to be soldering. Everything that has a soldering surface, which is those little tiny headers. All of those soldering surfaces have to be cleaned before soldering. I didn't show myself putting on my safety glasses, but do not ever forget to wear your safety glasses for soldering. I'll bore you with the same story that I tell anybody else that I try to teach about soldering. At my first internship, I was tasked with basically soldering up a bunch of product for the company for pretty much 8 hours a day for a couple of weeks. We had just gotten in a lot of orders, and I had started getting really lazy with keeping my soldering clean and keeping my iron clean, and I wasn't wearing my safety glasses. And you're soldering very, very tiny things, and you have your face real close because it's real tiny, and then the solder starts to get all bubbly because of all of the dirt that you've been leaving on the circuit board. And then that dirt starts to make it bubble, and then it pops right into your eye. And that's exactly what happened to me. I blinked fast enough, so I only got a blister on my eyelid, but safety glasses forever after that. So what I'm doing right now is I'm using my syringe of flux to apply flux to all of the soldering surfaces on the board itself. I'm not going to apply flux to the headers because the headers are going to be going into the solder pads, so it won't matter. Flux will be on the headers anyway. I had already did my transition, so it didn't show me hooking up the board into this clamp, but I'm using this clamp to just hold the board still
while I actually apply the solder. So there's the headers with all the flux on them, and I also have these headers on this side over here. Now there's a little trick that I do to make sure that I always have my headers completely aligned every single time I set up a board like this. Because, as you can see, you can kind of wiggle them a little bit when they're actually on the inside. So there's a slight possibility that you could get the alignment wrong. But that's okay, because what I just do is I simply solder one hole on the actual board itself, apply the iron, apply the solder real quick, and we have one single hole soldered right there. So then what we do is we partially insert the header into the set of holes, and obviously it's going to get blocked off because one of the holes is closed up. And clean off the iron and heat up that hole so that the header can pop through. And then from there, we just simply hold the header in place while the solder is cooling down to harden. Now we actually have a pretty solid piece of header that isn't just flopping left and right. Here's a view of the other side of the solder joint. Now this solder joint isn't necessarily complete. I'm going to end up reflowing this in a second. Reflowing means I'm going to remelt the solder and let it reset. So now that we've got the header set inside the board, we're going to go through and actually solder all of these. So let's change the camera angle so we can get a little bit more of a close-up. Alright, let's just hope that we don't splash my laptop with molten flux and solder. Alright, so now that we have a little bit of a better camera angle, I'm doing like this double camera thing. Alright, so I'm not sure if you can actually see that super well, but let's see if we can focus it. There we go. So the iron is showing a little bit of roughness, so I'm going to hit it up with that brass sponge, and I'm going to hit it with some of this tip tinner over here. So that's pretty globby, and then clean it off with the iron, and it should be pretty shiny. There we go. So that's what I mean by like keeping your iron very clean, keeping your solder joint very clean. Alright, so let's get back to the action. So I have a chisel tip on my iron, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to apply the flat end of the iron to the solder pad and press it up against the header pin to heat them up both at the same time. There we go. Now you don't want to necessarily be too ginger with this. You do want to apply the iron pretty firmly, just because you are actually trying to heat up the solder pad, and you're trying to heat up the solder pin at the same time, so that they actually melt the solder themselves. Now you notice all these fumes going off everywhere. There's a lot of solder products that have lead inside them, and you know, that's not the greatest thing to be breathing in lead. So do try to practice either like holding your breath when you have the iron going, with all the smoke going everywhere and everything. Always make sure that you're soldering outdoors or in an otherwise well ventilated area.
You also have the option of buying a face mask that has a little filter on it, or you can also buy an activated carbon air filter, which is basically a fan with a carbon filter on one side that extracts all the smoke and absorbs it. And then this last pin over here is that first one that we hit. Beautiful. Okay, so now that we've finished one side of the headers, we're going to do this other side. I've already fluxed it earlier. I'm going to put in just a little solder for one hole. And then I have this header here. And always make sure that you're trying to pay attention to what header you're touching when you do this, if you decide to copy my style, because you don't want to accidentally be touching this pin, which is getting hot when you apply the iron. Okay. Oh God. And okay. So here you can see I made the header a little bit out of alignment. I'm just going to hold it real steady. Okay. So I readjusted it, and there we have a little bit of a straighter header. Alright, so I'm just going to move this off a little bit to the side of my vise so that I can just access the pin header, or the header pins, a little bit easier. For the most part, when you're trying to melt the solder itself, you're not melting the solder on the iron as much as you're melting it on the solder pad and the solder pin. And then I'm going to just hit up that last one, because this was that first pin that I used for initial stability. There we go. Now this is still covered in flux and burned stuff from the soldering iron, so this is pretty dirty right now. So we actually want to hit it again with that flux spray that we used right at the beginning of this video, and that'll actually remove all of the flux from this. You want to remove that flux from this because that flux is actually corrosive a bit, so this will degrade the solder pins a little bit more. Now, if you don't have flux spray, if you don't know where to find it, you can usually get it at like Fry's Electronics. And if you don't have that, you can always go to Walgreens and get like 98% isopropyl alcohol and wash this with alcohol. Now, there's one final test that you would want to do for headers. After you've soldered up everything, you want to take your multimeter and you want to make sure that none of the headers that are adjacent to each other are electrically connected, because it's possible that you put a little dust of solder or something like that right next to the header, and that would make it short to the next header next to it. So what I'm saying is, if I put a little bit too much solder up here, a couple of these pins could actually short, and that would make something like, say, 2 power pins actually be connected, and that would be a very, very bad thing.
or something like a communication line hooked up to a battery line. That's a very bad thing. So what we do is we get our multimeter and we use our diode setting or continuity setting so it makes this sound whenever there's an actual continuous connection. And then we can go in and touch every 2 pins right next to each other to actually test if they're electrically connected. Oh, I just slipped. I accidentally slipped, so that was a false positive. And you'll know that there's a connection when you actually hear this sound. And notice we're not hearing any of these sounds for any of these headers unless I accidentally slip because I'm a fool. Okay, so all of this header is safe. And then I'm going to test all the adjacent ones on this end, just to make sure. Alright, all these headers are safe. So this board is good to go after we clean it. So now we're onto this guy. So what we want to do is we want to remove this header and then put one of these male headers on. Now I have one extra pin on here than I need for this, so I'm going to use my wire cutters and just snip it in between. Good reason, I have safety glasses. Now to remove some headers like these, I have kind of my own way of doing it, and it's a little bit destructive, and if your board is kind of sensitive, you may not want to do this. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this black housing, and then that's going to allow me to one by one remove all of these individual pins, and then I'll solder suck the rest of the solder out of them. And then I'll clean it, apply flux, and then put the new headers in. So here's that process. So now that I've actually removed these individual headers, I still have some solder in these holes, so I'm going to suck them out. So I'm going to heat up that solder joint, put the nozzle right up on it, right at on the other side, and that's probably real hard to see, but that hole is clear. And I'm doing it this way just because it's a lot easier for me to get the iron real close to the solder joint. Alright, now we've got our solder holes completely cleared. So we're going to add these pins. So I'm going to add some flux to this. Notice I'm doing this in a little bit of a different order than before. The solder that was in there previously is actually a little bit of enough to keep the headers in from friction.
So now we've got our flux on there. And let's solder one, and then make sure that it's aligned. Alright, so that's aligned. And now the solder is hardened and set. So now let's solder all the rest of them. Come on. Now do beware, previously soldered solder holes are a little bit harder to get solder to adhere to. Okay. And if you think that you're applying the iron for a little bit too long, because really it should not be on there for very long, then just take the iron off, let it cool down a sec, and then reapply the iron. Alright. And there we go. So now let's test it. Alright, so now let's test this. Alright, all the headers are completely isolated from each other, so we know that this is safe to use. And the only thing left to do is to do the final cleaning. Now this is where you're using the flux wash to actually get rid of all of the flux that's still on the circuit board.
Alright, so that's pretty much all I have for you. We soldered up a SparkFun Logmatic board, and we desoldered a real-time clock and put new headers on that thing. So you should know how to desolder a little bit and use the desoldering pump and put some new solder on there, and always make sure that you keep your soldering joints clean so that you don't bring about any kind of unwanted corrosion or bubbling that might splash onto your skin a little bit. It's not super dangerous or anything, but it does hurt. And remember, with soldering, a lot of what goes into a good soldering joint is practice and having a good feeling of how the solder acts when it melts and how it feels to apply the iron in just the right way, to melt the solder in just the right way. That just comes with practice. And what I would recommend is, before you solder up any kinds of permanent things for any soldering session, waste a little bit of solder on some just headers in an empty perf board. That way you can get back into the hang of soldering and get the feel for it again before you start ruining an actual important circuit board. Alright, that's all I have for you. Goodbye! My foot hurts.